Thanks very much, Alan. Yes, it's great to get the opportunity to share some of our plans that we've been working with others as to how we prepare for the imminent arrival of these fish later this year. Since 2017, we've been working with Marine Scotland, Nature Scotland, SEPA, really just to plan a range of actions centering around three key areas. So that'll be things like surveillance, management and publicity around these fish. And I'd just like to get the opportunity here to try and explain in more detail what these three elements of our work mean. And I think really just to kick off, the first thing to do is really just give a bit of context in terms of the life cycle of these unusual fish. And these are the smallest and most abundant of the Pacific salmon species. They're native to the Pacific seaboard. They've got a 2-year life cycle, so quite different from Atlantic salmon. The juvenile fish, they will either recruit from distinct odd or even years, so they're very separated. They're not like our salmon where they can have multiple year classes. They also spawn earlier than Atlantic salmon, so they tend to spawn to late summer, and they tend to spawn in the lower reaches of rivers rather than upper tributaries. So quite different in terms of their habits for spawning. And again, as you can see, they're visually quite different from Atlantic salmon. As they mature, they develop a humpback, and in the males, they initially look like fresh-run salmon. They're quite silvery, but once they've been in fresh water for a few weeks, they start to turn and mature and look very different from their own fish. They're an important food resource in certain areas, and in their native range, they support quite a number of commercial fisheries. So they are an economically important species for many communities. In terms of the history, it's just useful to sort of recap on how this all panned out. Going right back to the 1950s, there was some artificial stocking into the White Sea Basin at the tip of Russia, and these introductions failed. What they did was they introduced even year fish, and these that strain of fish weren't very well adapted to cold water temperatures, so that stocking programme ceased in the late 70s. And what they did was they tried to introduce odd year fish, and these were more successful. They were introduced in the mid 80s, and these fish are just a bit more adapted to the colder temperatures, and they tended to thrive in that area. And as you can see, they moved all the way around down here, and this is where we are at the moment. These populations became self-sustaining very quickly, very alarmingly. They got established in rivers around the Murmansk area, and that was a signal to stop stocking. These fish were doing very well of their own accord. And you can see this gives a sort of scale of the commercial fishery there. In 2021, they caught over 600 tonnes of these fish. So massive fisheries where these fish occur. So very, very important. But obviously these are artificial introductions. These fish are not in their natural range there. Just to give a bit of perspective, Norway are quite far ahead of us in terms of the invasions of these fish. They're close to Russia, and this gives a bit of scale about what's happened since 2016 and 2019. You can see the extent of the population in as little as 3 years. These fish have moved down that coast, and we've been getting this. Norwegian authorities have been getting this data through a whole variety of means. So that's through the angling catch, incidental angling catches, coastal net fisheries, snorkeling. So quite novel techniques to establish where these fish are present and absent. Dedicated trapping techniques, netting and spear guns, all sorts of techniques have been used to capture these fish in these regions. And what is interesting is the invasions before 2000 were really down to the high numbers of stock fry artificial interventions in the Russian rivers. But what is really quite alarming and interesting is the invasion as recently as 2017 has wholly stemmed from self-reproducing fish in Russian rivers and possibly also Norwegian rivers as well. So these fish are very plastic, they're very adaptable, and they're very, very good populating areas they haven't been native to. Moving closer to home, this gives a bit of perspective about the sort of timescales here. In the period from 1960 to 2016, there were only 30 records of these fish in 16 rivers. And if you fast forward to 2017, they've populated, well, they've certainly been observed in 42 rivers in Scotland, and in the UK, and 373 fish records. Probably the tip of an iceberg in terms of numbers, because we're relying on anecdotal evidence. It's not structured surveillance at the moment. It's really angling catch, it's incidental observations and so on. But 27 really represents a significant sea change with these fish appearing, and that's when they just suddenly arrived and really took us all quite by surprise. And since then, they've appeared in Scottish rivers. 2019 was slightly different. Lower water conditions, or higher water conditions, so the observations weren't quite as accurate. So we think that was a factor in the lower number in 2019. In terms of why this is happening, we don't know. It's thought to be climate change driven, much like a lot of changes in ecology and so on. There'll be a whole range of factors within that are driving this, but we don't have precise information at the moment. What is really quite alarming, and this is confounding our understanding on this species. Each year we learn something new, and they prove us wrong each time. We originally understood that these fish wouldn't really be viable in Scotland, but eggs were removed from pink salmon spawning areas, and they were found to be viable, and they hatched into juveniles the following year. So really quite alarming in terms of what we're learning with this. It's a very, very steep learning curve, and we're learning new things all the time. And this sort of illustrates that point. This was a study done last year just to examine how successful these fish are. And these are actually pink salmon smolts that hatch successfully in the River Sturgeon and Oykel in the north of Scotland, and that was in early March last year. And this was, I think, believed to be the first observation of pink salmon smolts that have been successfully hatched in Europe outside that sort of Scandinavian, Norwegian area. And really just provides evidence of successful spawning in 2021 and completion of that whole sort of freshwater life cycle. So that is, again, it's amazing, it's alarming, and it's really concerning that we're seeing this happening in this country, happening so quickly, and it's really kind of almost hot on the heels of what we're seeing in Norway as well. So try not to be too alarmist about it, but it is really quite concerning how successful these fish can be once they find conditions that will suit them. So why are we concerned? It's an obvious question. As we've heard this morning, Alan very eloquently described the whole range of pressures that our native Atlantic salmon are facing. What we need to understand about these fish are what are the direct interactions between pink salmon and their own sort of native Atlantic salmon, but also other freshwater ecology as well. They will have potentially all sorts of interactions and impacts on not just salmon, but a whole range of ecology in our aquatic ecosystems. This could include, as I say, impacts on wider species, competition for food or space, so habitat and available prey and invertebrates, all that sort of thing. And obviously physical disturbance or displacement of native fish. All these things are really, really big concerns that we have. And obviously the protection of our native biodiversity has to be a primary concern here. This is an absolutely stunning image that Richard Davis, who's in the audience here, provided for us. So thanks to Richard for sharing this image. It's a pink salmon in amongst a shoal of native Atlantic salmon that were caught on underwater drone, and this just shows you, I think there were 3 pink salmon in this area, all in individual shoals of Atlantic salmon, so they just seem to join onto individual shoals of wild salmon. And just to give Richard a little plug, Richard's footage will feature in the Wild Isles series on Sunday at the weekend, so just watch out for that. It's got some really amazing footage of Richard's underwater filming and photography. It's really stunning. Anyway, so cut to the chase. What's our role at FMS and partners? We've been involved in sort of strategic planning with Nature Scot, SEPA and Marine Scotland through a structured Pink Salmon task group. And that's really just to exchange knowledge and information, and also sharing information quite broadly with our international counterparts, and really just find out what's happening elsewhere, just trying to build the knowledge up and try and short circuit how we do things. Alan attended the Northern Hemisphere Pink Salmon Expert Group last year, and that was again just to exchange information as to what's happening. I mean, this issue is far bigger than what we're experiencing in Scotland. It's an international concern. These fish are very successful at populating many areas, so we need to just try and broaden our knowledge very quickly here. Through our own Scottish Fisheries Coordination Centre, we had a session last year, and that allowed us to share knowledge as well, both within Scotland but also through Finland and Norway, and sort of learning from their experience. And we published guidance, protocols. We've got an app now which collects real-time information and really just exports that into a central database. And that allows us to really just gather information quickly and really allows us to, I guess, collect it in one place. And that informs a lot of different things, such as invasive data that Nature Scot and SEPA pulled together. And it also allows us to sort of direct management action locally where we need to do that. And, you know, there's other stuff happening as well. It was great to see the AST Emerging Threats Initiative last year, where we got some really interesting sessions from lots of people, and that's now been published in a blue book, and I think AST are happy to share that with anybody that's interested. So what's planned for this year? Sort of based on our experiences since 2017, we're going to focus on 3 key areas. So that's surveillance, basically observations, catches and reports, really just trying to pull all that into one place. Management, so what do we do with these fish when we find them? We want to get them out there. What's safe, practical and effective? What will work? What doesn't work? We're going to learn. No point in just trying things that are not practical or effective. And again, awareness raising, making sure people know what to do, get guidance out there, make sure the press are aware and can help us get that message out there in terms of what's important and how we deal with this really serious issue. Surveillance is really just based on observations. What we want to do is really up the game in terms of that app, make sure people are aware of it and feed information in. And this is a sort of dashboard that we have which populates itself once people submit a record. That's on our website. Please take a look if you get a chance and interrogate the information. As I said, the data also feeds into the official invasive records as well. And we've now got resources through that group to support a baseline eDNA sampling programme. It's going to be nationwide later this year. And these fish shed their DNA in the water, and there'll be water sampling done in a structured way, really just to get a better handle on presence and absence. And what we want to try and do is expand that programme so that we're getting a more in-depth, detailed look within rivers to see where they're occurring and actually how far they're penetrating into rivers, and get a better handle on the tributaries and just how successful they are once they get in. Management, really key action. We've been trying to work within the legislation to develop plans to test what will work best. And this is an image of some netting on the River Oikle, trying to remove a shoal of fish that were encountered here. We've got licences to allow all this to happen, so we've applied for licences for our member network to allow them to deploy techniques to get these fish out using a variety of methods. As I say, varying degrees of success here. What works in one river might not work elsewhere, so we're continually trying to adapt our approach. And we've got a novel approach that we're supporting the Thurso River to hopefully pilot this year in terms of getting a fish trap in place. And this is a design here. This river is very attractive to these fish. However, these sort of interventions are very labour intensive. We've got to be selective. We've got to ensure we don't endanger native salmon. So there's a proposal to put this trap in a specific site in the Thurso, We're trying to go through the licensing process to make sure that we can get that in place this year and really support the Thurso River in terms of that process. And there's a lot of regulatory considerations that we need to think about in terms of protecting our native fish, getting it in the right place and making sure everything is done legally and safely. And again, raising awareness, we're well placed to raise awareness on this, getting that information out there, making sure that accessible guidance is available for people and make sure people know what to do, working within that group in terms of promoting media articles so where we can get a collective message. And really just using things like Scottish Invasives and Species Week to promote the message about invasive species more generally, and using our member network, the boards and trusts, really just to get that message out locally. So in summary, it's been a massively steep learning curve, but we can learn from others and share information. We just want to improve our surveillance techniques through that eDNA baseline programme, and acknowledge that there are challenges here, quite serious challenges for management, both in terms of practical aspects, but also in resourcing and capacity. I mean, the current resources held by our network are insufficient to really support this in a big, meaningful way. So we've got to acknowledge that challenge and really try and respond to that. And I'll just end on that and saying doing nothing is not an option here. We really need to, pull together and make this happen and make sure that we deal with this seriously. But thanks for listening. That's me.